Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's talk by Duncan McGibbon on Why Should Hamlet Die? And thank you for coming on such a sort of mixed evening, bit of rain, bit of everything else. So hope you enjoy the talk, and I'll say a few words about the speaker. So Duncan McGibbon was born in Greenock, Scotland. I hope I've got the pronunciation correct.
Yes, you have.
In 1949. He attended St. Mary's University, Strawberry Hill, and King's College, London. He was a member of the Poets' Workshop, which ran through the 60s to the 90s, where his mentors were, among others, Philip Hobsbawm, George Macbeth, Leonard Clark, Peter Porter, and Alan Brownjohn. He began publishing in journals in the 1970s. Duncan lived and worked in Geneva and Bern, commuting between his British and Swiss workshops until he moved to Bath. He toured Australia, read at the Melbourne Festival, and was a prize winner at the Wells Literary Festival. The Workshop, 1984, celebrated its 25th anniversary with an anthology, Divers. Duncan published his first collection, Consolations, in December 2010. His poems have appeared in the summer edition of the Salzburg Review and a short story in the collection, Jigsaw, published in Bern. Duncan is a poetry and poet's voice co-coordinator at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, which is this wonderful institution. And he currently belongs to a time bank workshop that met over 100 times during lockdown in Bath and Geneva. Both continue weekly to this day. Duncan's interest in Hamlet began when the English teacher at his school walked out over difficulties she had over the school production. He was asked to write the school play, and he did so with the Hamlet Affair, which ran to packed audiences for 3 whole days. Ladies and gentlemen, Duncan McGibbon.
Thank you very much, Dipali. I'm going to talk I'm going to give a talk which is in 4 parts. In the first, I want to introduce the idea of the actualization of death in drama. Secondly, I want to compare the way in which Shakespeare presents this with Walter Raleigh's poem about the course of life, and also with Andrew Marvell's poem about the soul and the body. After that, I'm going to do an analysis of the way in which Shakespeare uses the word soul in Hamlet, the different levels of meaning, etc. And I'm going to try and distinguish between the backgrounds to those, which will lead me to the third part, which is really to compare the Calvinistic, Catholic, and also the Stoic elements in his audience. And finally, I'm going to come to 2 conclusions, which I won't tell you until we reach them, all right? But one of them will, of course, be my view as to why Hamlet dies. So the poetry of Hamlet makes the awareness of death actual in his audience, not just through voices and gestures of its characters, but by bringing to the fore the assumptions his audiences make about death. I say audiences because whether we make the same assumptions because we are watching Hamlet today, or we make different assumptions, both involve actualization. By actual or actualized, I mean the play brings to act an awareness of death in his audience, whether you be a humanist, 21st century, the actualization. And of course, I am talking about drama in the theatre. I'm pretty skeptical as to whether Netflix really does bring this about. But anyone who's experienced the drama in the intimacy of the theatre would probably recognize what I'm trying to get at with actualization. This is the process from culture to consumption as proposed by Michael Bristol in 1996. Culture influences the values that consumers hold and the way they perceive these values, despite their notorious relativity. The audience witnesses death and participates because the given culture makes it consumable. We consume Hamlet still. The wrong emphasis diminishes actualization. Revenge plays or films based on Hamlet without the striving soul or the self-making performer, such as Get Carter, can be very violent and grim, or sentimental, like The Lion King. Hamlet spurns revenge because he does not have the capacity to play God. Yet he does not want sentiment, as he has a mission to restore justice. Yet merely serving up death, such as in Gorboduc, does not make a play popular. Hamlet, however, is always in the top 5 popular Shakespeare plays, even though it is his longest and actually slays 9 lives. Titus Andronicus, just for information, William Shakespeare's bloodiest play, the body count reaches 14. The characters also take their lives in their hand in Richard III, where the body count is 11, and King Lear, which is 1 less, 10. To Elizabethan audiences, and I'll refer to this again, a certain barbarism was acceptable. But Hamlet's deaths are strange deaths. Hamlet the play begins in mourning for a dead king, quickens with a haunting by that king, mourns a girl, makes accidental and offstage assassination, turns on her funeral, and ends with multiple obsequies for murder, suicide, and accident. Though we debate grief at Claudius's court, fear the ghost, smell the rot of Denmark, suspect the guilt of Claudius, consider life after death, mourn Ophelia, revolt against the grave, and witness revenge and murder, yet the remarkable feature of Hamlet lies in the collocation of meanings about death the event actualizes. Nobody dies in Hamlet except in a halo of meaning, vicious or otherwise. Nobody dies the same death. The murdered king is dispossessed of power. Polonius dies of his own tricks, Ophelia of her own passion, the queen of her ambivalent innocence. King Claudius of revenge, Laertes of King Claudius's poison. Yet Hamlet dies by accident. To summarize, each death makes actual the awareness of death in the audience. They bring death to act from culture into consumption. Culture both influences the values that consumers hold and the way they perceive these values. Yet what are these values that makes Hamlet the play uniquely consumable, and how does the audience understand or perceive why Hamlet should die? His death in the play actualizes assumptions about Hamlet, the character. Yet what are these assumptions? To help answer this question, I want to discuss Walter Raleigh's 1612 elegy on the life of man. I mean, Walter Raleigh was in prison at the time, and I think 1612 is an approximate, but it is nonetheless reasonably contemporary with Shakespeare's Hamlet. Raleigh was well known, a gentleman writer, because it was among the daring do's a gentleman did, a historian, a soldier, an explorer, a polymath, and damnable proud, according to Aubrey. He was the ideal man, according to Castiglione's The Courtier. Written in the same year as Hamlet, Raleigh's allegory actualizes such awareness as detached impermanence, suddenly upended by death in an extended allegory drawn from the theatre. As it's short, I will read it. What is our life? A play of passion, our mirth, the music of division, our mother's wombs, the tiring house bee. When we are dressed for this short comedy, heaven, the judicious sharp spectre is, that sits and marks still who doth act amiss. Our graves that hide us from the searching sun are like drawn curtains when the play is done. Thus march we playing to our latest rest. Only we die in earnest. That's no jest. The course of life in Raleigh is like a play which needs to be introduced, well, quite frankly, by coitive laughter in the music of division. He is one of the players entering costumed fiction, which has rules, and a critic as political interrogator judges the act as to how well it has been performed. Yet the judicious, sharp spectre is a double allegory for he who doth act amiss, for a moral entity and the reality of the law. The age of Topcliffe, Walsingham and Burleigh was only just gone, yet much the same structures of persecution existed, and this poem was most likely written during the poet's final imprisonment. Death is presented as a fugitive condition. It is real and cannot be acted, thus breaking the metaphor. The actualization of life in Raleigh is that of self-realization cut short by the reality of death, as a play makes a clear distinction between performance and reality. They are kept apart until death joins them in nothingness, though death is an abstraction and not described. Heaven itself is there as a spectator or spectre. He uses this word spectre quite deliberately because the word spectre means a ghost, as well as having other means. The nearest thing to the soul, Raleigh, reputedly an atheist, is prepared to admit to. About 80 years later, in a world transformed by civil war, regicide and commonwealth, Andrew Marvell wrote a dialogue between the soul and the body, which actualizes death as a conflict between the two inseparable allegorical figures, captive and captor body, and captive and captor soul. It's rather difficult to imagine this situation where the body traps the soul and the soul traps the body. I mean, if you think of those Daily Express cartoons where you've got people hanging from chains with a little caption below, quite frankly, it's that kind of very direct analogy that Marvell is making. I'm going to read this because, again, it's not too long. Soul, oh, who shall from this dungeon raise a soul, enslaved so many ways, with bolts of bones that fettered stands, in feet and manacled in hands, here blinded with an eye, and there deaf with the drumming of an ear, a soul hung up, as 'twere in chains of nerves and arteries and veins, tortured besides each other part, in a vain head and double heart. The body replies, oh, who shall deliver whole from the bonds of this tyrannic soul, which stretched upright impales me so, that mine own precipice I go, and warms and moves this needless frame. A fever could but do the same, and wanting where it spite to try, he has made me live to let me die, a body that would never rest, since this ill spirit it possessed. The soul answers, what magic could me thus confine within another's grief to pine, where whatsoever it complain, I feel that cannot feel the pain, and all my care itself employs, that to preserve me destroys, constrained not only to endure diseases, but what's worse, the cure, and ready off the port to gain, I'm shipwrecked into health again. Body. But physic could never reach the maladies thou me dost teach, whom from the cramp of hope dost tear, and then the palsy shakes of fear, the pestilence of love does heat, or hatred's hidden ulcer eat. Joy's cheerful madness does perplex, or sorrow's other madness vex, which knowledge forces me to know, and memory will not forego. What but for a soul could have the wit to build me up for sin so fit, as architects do square and hew green trees that in the forest grew. So the poem is a dialogue between the body and the soul, both of which implausibly imprison each other. The soul fears help and health. Health readies the soul for sin. The poem ends, however, with a victory for the body, for the soul depends upon the body, and the soul sustains the body through its sufferings. The soul, its survival and its presence, is a parallel to death. Both writers help to disentangle the astonishing rhetorical mesh of deaths in Hamlet. Both Raleigh and Marvell make explicit boundaries for the soul or spectre. Marvell very subtly has the green wood turned into a city, which readies it for sin, yet echoes the Platonic view that the city extends the soul. Both poems take in the dimensions of Shakespeare's rhetoric. Hamlet is both the dangerous self-performer in his pretended madness of Raleigh and the pure soul of Marvell, seeking salvation and to break out of the body. All three writers reflect the beliefs of their time. For followers of Seneca and his dramatic tragedies, the soul is a hidden substance capable of influencing and being influenced by the body. According to Christians, it has three aspects: intellective, spiritual, and appetitive. Catholic Christians upheld purgatory as a state between life and heaven. And Calvinists denied it. It was treated as a substance rather than an invisible spiritual entity. It is a substance capable of being influenced by the will. In Raleigh's poem, there is only a spectre, a hint of the soul, though in the interrogating sun seems to play a role for conscience. In Marvell, the soul's 21 lines play their part in detesting everything the body stands for. You can see how Marvell's depiction of the soul fits into many of the soliloquies, especially in the early part of the play, which you get from Hamlet. The soul seeks death, the body life, yet the body can torture the soul and vice versa. It is an opposition between the Platonic assent of the soul and the Calvinist contempt for the physical body. For Marvell, the soul is also Platonic and capable of separation from the body, yet ideally for a Puritan, because we're looking quite a few years ahead. Puritan was an emergent movement during Shakespeare's time, but we see it fulfilled in a way in Marvell's work. It should be balanced as his pastoral poems of solitude express. Hamlet, the protagonist, combines both a desire to be rid of the body and a self-performer evading the demands of the soul. I mean, when it's well produced and you've got a brilliant actor acting Hamlet, his quips are some of the funniest things you can find in Elizabethan theatre. So now we're going to look at the different ways in which Shakespeare uses the word soul in Hamlet. The abiding Calvinistic and Christian metaphor is that of a measure or a scales for which an even balance is sought between the soul and the body. This chimes with Coleridge's admittedly romantic view that there is a just coincidence of external and internal action. Pleasure is always the result, but where the former is deficient, realities will seem cold and unmoving. That's from his lecture on Hamlet. This is a Stoic Senecan view, but just to confuse you, Calvin admired Stoicism. For Stoics, the soul is corporeal and is rational and one. It can be seen as a supernatural entity, a good soul. It can sicken with sin or be troubled by struggle. It is first used by Hamlet as a synonym for the conscience untroubled by evil. Despite its presence in the world, his good conscience is informed by Hamlet's elect will. Till then, sit still, my soul. Foul deeds will rise through all the earth, o'erwhelm them to men's eyes. The predominant image of the soul in the scene 3 dialogues between Laertes and Ophelia and Laertes and Polonius is that of a careful, rational balance between spiritual and secular concerns, not excluding a certain hypocrisy. The word is used by Laertes to Ophelia, but as this temple waxes, the inward service of the mind and soul, to reassure Ophelia that young Hamlet will return to a mature love of his sister. The soul is in balance with the intellect, capable of appetitive growth. Polonius uses the same sense of the soul as balance in his words to Laertes. Grapple them, he's referring to your friends, unto thy soul with hoops of steel. To grapple is to bind, and the soul here requires the balance of friendship. Polonius makes a contrasting point to Ophelia. How prodigal the soul lends the tongue vows. The balance of the soul can be disturbed by passions, but prudence will cure them. Post-ghost and madness, back in the throne room, Polonius immediately uses the word as a balance to King Claudius. I hold my duty as I hold my soul, both to my God and to my gracious king. And again later, therefore, since brevity is the soul of wit, I will be brief. Though here it is the soul more in the sense of essence, witty, empty, and conventional. But Shakespeare also uses the word soul in a very Catholic sense. The word used by Hamlet to the ghost expresses the soul as emotional appetite jolted out of balance by an awesome moral voice. What may this mean, horridly to shake our disposition with thoughts beyond the reaches of our souls? Say, why is this? Wherefore? What should we do? But once the use of the word soul becomes theological and extends beyond the will's control, we are no longer in Wittenberg, but the Marian world of Shakespeare's childhood. The soul is a spiritual seeker for God. Later, Hamlet to Horatio expresses the doctrine of immortality, which was common to Christianity and Stoicism. And for my soul, what can it do to that, being a thing immortal as itself? It waves me forth again. I'll follow it. The ghost terrifies Hamlet, and actually I think still manages to terrify the audience, yet uses a more secular interpretation of the world. It seems to boast its supernaturality. Even death is no barrier, as both the soul of the ghost and Hamlet are immortal. It certainly adds to the ghost's autumnness. I could a tale unfold, whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul, freeze thy young blood. Here, the soul seems to be a spirit level that cannot take in evils beyond its measure to comprehend. Hamlet then uses the word in hearing of the ghost's disclosure. Oh, my prophetic soul, mine uncle, which relate back to the earlier Wittenberg man of conscience. Wittenberg, of course, was the center of Calvinism, but also of Lutheranism. And Shakespeare, for once, uses his geography very deliberately, which the ghost confirms. The ghost then warns Hamlet not to offend his mother, using the word as a synonym for conscience. Shakespeare here seems to be thinking that the ghost has a privileged insight into the conscience of his wife. It's the way in which I understand the ghost's re-emergence in the play at a time when Hamlet is talking to his mother. Take not thy mind, nor let thy soul contrive against thy mother aught. Later, Hamlet is reminded of this. A conscience can harden. Let not ever the soul of Nero enter this firm bosom. My tongue and soul in this be hypocrites. How in my words somever she be shent. To give them seals never, my soul consent. Hamlet addresses his soul thrice in these lines, to bid it should not be cruel and be inactive. The soul is evoked as a governing concept, rather like the concept of grace. Later in the same soliloquy, Hamlet uses the word first as a resolution, not to be spontaneous, and next is a resolution not to control his words. By the way, the reference to Nero comes from the unfortunate encounter of Seneca and his boss. As well as that Catholic theme, there's also the Catholic theme of repentance. In the Queen's words, she appeals to Hamlet. "O Hamlet, speak no more. Thou turn'st mine eyes into my very soul, and there I see such black and grained spots as will not leave their tint." The guilty soul graphically contains the stains of sin, yet the ghost prevents Hamlet's anger. Oh, step between her and her fighting soul. The struggling soul is one resisting temptation. The ghost seems to be aware of Gertrude's goodness. Hamlet adjures the Queen not to deceive herself and thus lay bare her guilty soul. Lay not that flattering unction to your soul, that not your trespass but my madness speaks. We hear the spirited soul in Hamlet's soliloquy on the players. Only the soul, seemed a spirited conscience, can survive the dream of passion and address the guilty soul. Passion is also a word used by Raleigh. What is our life? A play of passion. But you see how Raleigh's Calvinism gets him to downgrade passion. So more passion later. Is it not monstrous that this player here, but in a fiction, in a dream of passion, could force his soul so to his own conceit, that guilty creatures sitting at a play have, by the very cunning of the scene, been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. We are back in the world of Raleigh, only the price of the stage has been heightened. The king suffers an awesome intuition in his guilty soul, which matches Hamlet's discerning one. There's something in his soul, o'er which his melancholy sits unbrewed, and I do doubt the hatch and the disclosure. That's the king on Hamlet. Hence, Hamlet orders to Horatio, even with the very comment of thy soul, observe mine uncle. In the dialogue before the players, the king asks, what do you call the play? And Hamlet replies, the Mousetrap, your majesty, and we will have free souls. It touches us not. Let the gold jade wince, our withers are unwrung. So the soul, as a kind of renewal of emotions, in a neutral sense, is being run by Hamlet, though ironically, he has exactly the opposite intention. Here, Hamlet stresses the uncontrolled freedom of the king over his soul in an ironic provocation. The queen professes her anxiety to Ophelia. Let her come in to my sick soul, as sin's true nature is. Each toy seems prologue to some greater miss. The toy, of course, is referring to the herbs. Now, for Calvinists, the passionate soul is an unbalanced soul and therefore not in a good state of grace. As distinct from the Catholic point of view, for example, a man whom I'll mention later, speaks of passions I approve, and he then goes on to say that the passions must be directed to a devotional end, but passion in itself perfectly acceptable to Robert Southwell. However, from a Calvinist point of view, right, we know how the spirited soul in Hamlet's soliloquy on the players, only the soul seen as a spirited conscience and can survive the dream of passion and address the guilty soul. Passion is also a word used by Raleigh. I think I've quoted this before. What is our life? A play of passion. Is it not monstrous that this player here, but in a fiction, in a dream of passion, could force his soul so as to his own conceit? That guilty creature sitting at a play hath by the very cunning of the scene been struck, so as to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefictions. The Calvinists, who were very fond of referring to evil as a sickness, in a way joined together with the Stoic concept of the sick soul. I've already mentioned that Calvin was very fond of Stoicism and very frequently quoted it, even though obviously he was a Christian. Hence, Hamlet's orders to Horatio. Sorry, I'm going to repeat this. Hamlet's references to the soul touches on the king's guilty soul. Yet the king has a twisted conscience driving a divided soul, as he says to the queen, "Oh, come away, my soul is full of discord and dismay." Later, the guilty conscience of Claudius calls out to God. His limed soul is as a bird caught in an Elizabethan or Marvellian Baroque trap. But guilt is a Catholic concept. Remember the title of the player's prey, the mousetrap. "O limed soul, that struggling to be free art more engaged. Help, angels, make essay, bow stubborn knees and heart with strings of steel." This is where Claudius drops to his knees, even though Hamlet is behind him, either with a crossbow or with a sword, ready to kill him. Right? Hamlet refers to the Catholic condition of purgatory, which eventually admits the soul to heaven. Calvin and Luther completely rejected this belief, yet Hamlet holds back, to which Claudius a worse fate. "And am I then revenged to take him in the purging of his soul, when he is fit and seasoned for his passage? Then trip him, that his heels may kick at heaven, and that his soul may be as damned and black." Hamlet wants Claudius to be on a fast track to hell. His mercenary contract with his father is more binding. It is morally superior to the Christian's obligation to seek the reconciliation of others. It is as if the ghost has acted as an agent for God. Another reference to Catholic purgatory takes place when Ophelia is alone. She mourns her father in the afterlife of his soul in purgatory. God have mercy on his soul, and of all Christian souls, I pray God, God be with ye. Now, for anyone to refer to that in the strictures of Elizabethan and Jacobean England would have meant some kind of report. However, it should be bear in mind that Shakespeare frequently uses the condition of madness to make what you could call illicit statements of religion safe from criticism, because after all, the person was mad. So in Calvin, there's no need to pray for the elect as they are in heaven, nor for the damned as they are in hell. The evil in Claudius's soul seeks an alliance in Laertes, and we shall jointly labor with your soul to give it due content. The verb expresses the manipulation of Laertes by the king. And when the king justifies taking no action against Hamlet, it is because Hamlet is the queen's favorite whom his sick soul idolizes. So, she's so conjunctive to my life and soul that as the stars move not but in his sphere, I could not but by her. The Calvinists, of course, believed that certain people were elect, and this was very, very prevalent in Elizabethan society, even though the Church of England itself was both Lutheran and, in its own way, Calvinist. In the churchyard scene, the gravedigger answers Hamlet's question with a blithe faith. "One that was a woman, sir, but rest her soul, she's dead." Later, Laertes makes for Hamlet's throat. "The devil take thy soul." Hamlet responds, "Thou prayest not well." This is another hint that Hamlet has an elected soul. Hamlet's saving grace shares my deep soul's election with Horatio. Which leads me now to the other use that Shakespeare puts the word soul to, the Stoic predestined soul. The stamp of one defect predestined its fate or outcome, and the mutes or audience fearfully looking on witness inevitable doom. Both Raleigh and Marvell concur. In Raleigh, the grave is the curtain drawn on departed life, and in Marvell, this tyrannic soul will drop him finally in a precipice. In the opening and closing lines of the play, does Hamlet play out the fate and the fashioning of man as foreordained by God or gods? Or is he a Calvinist elect, passing into heaven after a life of virtue? Or conversely, is he a soul separating from the body to join his Father in purgatory? More to the point, does he really have to die at all? Shakespeare has intertwined the three most prominent beliefs in his audience. There were lots of people who were looking back to the age of Mary, and prior to that, who valued Robert Southwell, for example, a very recently martyred Jesuit, his poetry was a bestseller. Now, the reason for that, of course, was this very, very strong, I would say, in a sense, backward-looking nostalgia. On the other hand, there was very, very strong motivation, especially as you were going to be fined if you didn't turn up in church. Very, very strong motivation to follow the Church of England's articles and books of prayer. On the other hand, especially amongst the literati, amongst the people who frequented, we know they frequented Shakespeare's playhouse, to actually adopt a Stoic attitude. But what's interesting is the way in which he succeeds in intertwining them. I suspect, as you followed all the different turns, what Calvin was saying, what Catholics were saying, it gets to be a complicated business. Yet actually, Hamlet is really effective at its most uncomplicated moments, at its confrontations. So, first of all, then, the Calvinist Shakespeare. Death was the consequence of sin in Christian Europe, stemming from Genesis. Yet, does Hamlet die a Calvinist, a Catholic, or a Senecan Stoic's death? Shakespeare has Hamlet emphasize the irony of one vicious mole causing such terrible consequences, which I've touched on before. Shakespeare accurately describes the attitude of this young man from Wittenberg as a very strict Calvinist. Bristol, the professor, Hamlet's puritanical revulsion over sexual disorder, dissimulation, and dishonesty in the court express a somewhat wavering commitment to the kind of political vocation required in the tradition of Calvin. Hamlet's comment on the corruption of the Danish courts could simply be the verdict of a strict Calvinist. As such, his comments are general and not ones of a man suspecting a murder. The comments on Gertrude's marriage to Claudius, again, a little more than kin, a little less than kind, strike a Calvinist note with its alliteration of kin and kind. Kind is here following Charlton, Black, rather than Thompson and Taylor, these are editions of Shakespeare, to be read as nature. Calvin had a narrow view of incest and would have viewed Claudius's marriage as incestuous because against nature. However, the Wittenberg Hamlet is something of a parody. Yet a parody is used to give a serious insight into the protagonist's mind. There is irony in Shakespeare's characterization of Hamlet's opening Calvinism. This shows how Shakespeare actualizes personality through belief. This is true of the relationship between Hamlet and his mother Gertrude. In the opening scenes, Hamlet regards Gertrude as damned through her incest. In the first soliloquy, Hamlet wants the genetic confines of flesh to burst, and this can be interpreted as his desire to be separated genetically from his mother, so as not to be tainted with her crime. Hamlet's later dialogue with his mother could be understood as an attempt to get her to see sin and be reconciled, rather than his earlier total condemnation, hence his violence. Marvell's double heart also points to a Calvinistic cleavage between divine love and sensual love. His soul is a cartoonish sketch of a prisoner stretched on the body's chains. At no other point in Hamlet is Shakespeare's character quite as imprisoned as in Act 1, Scene 2. Claudius and the Queen want to minimize mourning, yet the Wittenberg Hamlet persists in his mourning to underline the Calvinist morality that death implies general guilt for sin. But I have that within. Both Raleigh and Marvell argue in contraries. For Marvell, it is the paradox that both the soul and the body want the same thing, to be rid of each other. The soul is blinded with an eye. Marvell, Shakespeare, takes the Calvinist view that the elect soul, divorced from the body, immediately enters the kingdom. He deliberately contrasts the frailty of the flesh with the purity of the soul. That builds up the self to commit sin. In Raleigh, mirth is the music of division, an oxymoron. As usual in Raleigh, a paradox is also a pun. The division was an interval between acts, a romp before the rope. Life is a play in the sense of a game and performance of passion. This again is also a pun on passion as suffering, but also sexual lovemaking. When we turn to the Catholic Shakespeare, again we follow Marvell here, who follows Descartes in his strict division of the body from the soul. This was a Catholic view because the soul separates from the body at death. Raleigh does not make the distinction. Hamlet is confronted with his father beyond the reaches of our souls and shares his immortal soul. Appearance of the ghost to Horatio and then to Hamlet knock Hamlet's Calvinism into touch, because Calvin had no belief in purgatory whatsoever and forbade people, in fact, to pray for the souls of the people whom they loved and who had parted. If you go into Bath Abbey, the very first time I was there, I was struck by the fact that although it was full of all sorts of monuments and all sorts of mementos about people, in not one single inscription was there anything about praying for people's souls. And it just struck me the first time I entered that. Hamlet addresses the ghost as thou, as if skeptical of its relationship to his father. When the ghost speaks, Hamlet is more respectful. Two issues of which the audiences, I'm sure of before now, become manifest. Claudius is a murderer, and the ghost is a real survivor from the grave and no illusion. Remember, the way in which Shakespeare contrives it is that the ghost is first of all seen by completely objective observers before Hamlet himself enters the scene. His ghostly father's injunction is both a moral directive and a corrective to his youthful book reading. Both are of equal importance. Not only is young Hamlet's faith contradicted by a soul in existence after death, but the soul is no goblin. Hamlet plays with the idea that, in fact, the ghost could be a cursed apparition, but gradually, bit by bit, he leaves that behind. Hamlet has to decide between two contrary moral prescriptions: not to kill and to obey a divine decree. This was paralleled in the Catholic world between those who preferred the Ridolfi plot, which was to rescue Queen Mary of Scots, and the gunpowder plot, which was being thought of even then, to put right what many saw was an unjust denial of Catholic rights, and the way of his cousin. Robert was actually a cousin of Shakespeare. Hamlet's soliloquy is in marked contrast to his earlier Calvinistic rejection of suicide. He is more concerned about any survival of the self after death, which is really what the soliloquy to be or not to be is about. It's about if there is life after death, what on earth does it add up to? That's really what he's concerned with in there. Calvin, in his Institutes, denies that sleep and dreaming tell us anything about the survival of the soul. That in an age when to be Catholic was viewed as treachery, Hamlet's not divulging the message of the ghost and his swearing of Horatio and his attendance to silence parallels the role of a recusant in Elizabethan society. Now, from the point of view of Senecan Stoicism, despite its very Catholic credentials, Hamlet might view the ghost in terms of Senecan service, undermining all his former beliefs. There are Roman ghosts in Shakespeare, and they are alluded to in Hamlet itself. There is evidence for the influence of Seneca and Stoicism on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Calvin was also influenced by Senecan Stoicism, and his thought often strays into Stoic morality. For example, Calvin wanted his reforms to be seen as part of a wider humanism, at one in affirming the existence of a supernatural providence which excludes chance and overrules princes. Hamlet's famous praise of humanity echoes Calvin very closely. Hamlet afterwards queries the ghost at its testimony and thinks it could be a demon. This is very similar to the complaint in the dialogue, which has made him live to let me die. Hamlet the skeptic emerges as a foil to his madness. It is as if the stoic face of Calvin has turned up. The skepticism, in turn, tested in his encounters with the court. The performance of the player keeps the audience guessing as to the guilt or innocence of Claudius. The players also allow Hamlet the skeptic to be more detached and experimental. Marvell deliberately emulates a Senecan distance in his dialogue that comes to no conclusion. The very stagey poetry in the player's play has a Senecan resonance to it. T.S. Eliot, a disliker of Hamlet, would have Shakespeare be a Senecan Stoic. This would allow him to avoid any assertion of belief in the play, as Shakespeare does. For him, poetry is as real as anything gets. Eliot was committed to the idea that we don't really understand reality and we can't really reach it, but that poetry gives us what's called an objective correlative, which allows us to play with it. And that's the reason why he dislikes Hamlet, because in Hamlet, you've got somebody referring to real beliefs, and that's not something that Eliot's prepared to consider. Shakespeare's audience experienced religion, whether it wanted to or not. And the good thing about Seneca is, although you had to turn up to church, it didn't get you into trouble. So public death was commonplace in Shakespeare's time. Plague, trials, executions, bear baiting, funerary sermons, and the ritual passing of nobles and monarchs were all shared events in Elizabethan times. According to Geoffrey Forgan, in a society without a professional police force to enforce its laws, social control relied heavily on the use of spectacles of punishment. Public death is actualized in the burial of Ophelia. The audience would have recognized the rites were maimed, i.e. without the blessing of the corpse, as Ophelia was a suspected suicide. Christianity as a whole viewed a suicide as dying in mortal sin and therefore risking immediate damnation. Ophelia's balancing virginity is taken into consideration in allowing her to be buried in sanctified land. Hamlet's comments on death and decay are not so much a Calvinist view of the rottenness of fallen nature as a Stoic dismissal of mourning. Yorick's skull is a stinking banality compared to Hamlet's memory of him. This is not the same as the play's stench of sin. Nature decays and yet renews. It both aspires to perfection and reveals perfection. The hope of Laertes actualizes this belief in his statement that violets might grow from a virgin corpse. The Elizabethan culture of fear is replicated in the culture of Elsinore. You shall nose him as you go upstairs into the lobby. All three poets look backwards in their works. The reference to emblem literature in My Lady's Table shows Shakespeare's need to present to his audience a very mixed view of death. Death, from the point of view of any one belief, was not consumable in England. Here it is anti-feminist. You can think of a situation where, supposing you had to write a play for an audience of Brexiteers and anti-Brexiteers. The problem basically is, although you might know exactly who believes what, how do you hold it together? And this is the question I'm moving towards here. This is consistent with the undertow of Marvell's dialogue, because it too has balance and emblematic nuance to it. It stops short of death's popular appearance in morality plays generated by soliloquies continuous with the medieval traditions. Why are there so many soliloquies in Hamlet? It's because if you look at medieval plays, they mostly consisted of soliloquies. Therefore, there is evidence here of an influence. Marvell's dialogue looks back to medieval débat. Raleigh's poem too looks back to an older tradition in its classical memento mori and the dance of death motive. The emphasis on personal sin that sits and marks who still doth act amiss, that's Raleigh, is more Catholic than Calvinist. Hamlet quotes the recently martyred Robert Southwell, who was a close cousin of his, in the graveyard scene. Shakespeare possibly wrote an introduction to Southwell's poems, which were published after his death. Before Shakespeare died, there was no initials after the preface, but after Shakespeare's death, the initials WS were added to his preface to Southwell's poems. So I regard that as being, again, it's never strong enough to be a clue. It's never weak enough to be something that you really have to look into. So many links have been found with Southwell's verse in Venus and Adonis, Romeo and Juliet, King Lear, and other writings. Two examples are interesting. Claudius's advice to Hamlet to accept death, for what we must know must be, and is as common as any, the most vulgar thing to sense. And comments about mortality as a natural phenomenon are rebutted, even though they strike a profound level of common sense. In other words, in Southwell's writing, you will find a rebuttal of that Claudian view. Another comes from a poem misattributed to Southwell upon the image of death, in which the dust of Julius Caesar is described, which parallels imperial Caesar dead and turned to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. So this really brings me to my first conclusion. Hamlet is a forceful actualization of the plurality of belief in his audience. Southwell, the Catholic martyr, a best-selling poet after his death, yet at the same time, the Anglican Church demanded Sunday observance, and Seneca was popular among the wits. The audience of Hamlet, though, had little choice but to believe these divergent beliefs. This leads to my first conclusion. Shakespeare actualizes awareness of death by plunging the audience into these situations, and he almost deliberately promotes plurality of belief. He is literally confronting his audience here, right? Though, as I said before, you don't necessarily get away with that. Through staged deaths, the audience lives the contradiction of enforced religious change. Yet the play, despite having every source imaginable attributed to it by critics, might seem to lack a frame capable of taking in all these aspects. Just to go back to the analogy with the Brexits and the anti-Brexiteers, if you were a playwright writing for them, and I confess that I'm not, but nonetheless, if one wants to do that, you would probably want to go back into history before Brexit or anti-Brexit was even thought of, in order to find some way of being able to underline shared values, which, as I've said earlier, without these shared values, you don't actualize death. The general atmosphere of the play depends very much on the unity with which Shakespeare actualizes death. So that's why the larger picture is more important here. Shakespeare seems to be replying to Southwell's criticism that poetry lies about the passing world. In Venus and Adonis, he deliberately borrows Southwell's language. He trades passion for God for passion for beauty. As you've said, Catholics approve of passion. And I don't know whether, I don't think it'll come to me, but Geoffrey Hill, in the book he published before The Orchard of Zion, excuse my memory, actually quoted Southwell, passions I approve. So again here, Hamlet seems to combine a sensual immediacy, but also a very, very distant devotionalism. In this, he returns to medieval traditions. As a child, Shakespeare probably was taken with his father to watch miracle and mystery plays because it was the only theatre available at the time. So chronologically, it's quite possible that in fact he could have seen this. Features such as the guard's vigil at the very beginning of the play echoes the second shepherd's play, where they have to deal with a stranger, because obviously in the second shepherd's play, what they're dealing with actually are the angels announcing the birth of Christ. Another morality play stands behind Hamlet and tells us why this imprisoned soul unwittingly is made to strut on a Raleighn stage, and tells us why he should die, which leads to my second conclusion. Hamlet is every man from the medieval morality play. Only through reference to an earlier common tradition can the divided audience be consumers of the whole. So lots of people in that audience would in fact have seen and would have, I mean, they were suppressed by Elizabeth, but would have seen miracle and morality plays, in particular morality plays, because that's what every man is. The ghost, as every man's God, summons him in a revenger's death, but Hamlet, every man, seeks a delay should he encounter a companion. Hamlet could have met death immediately, but it did not guarantee justice. So God tells Hamlet, if you can find a friend, then I'll delay your death. Every man bargains his delay in the encounter with kindred and cousin, who then, of course, desert him, just as Hamlet's companions have deserted him. Ophelia, who lies about Polonius, and Laertes, who has left for Paris. Though another character, Goods, promises to help every man, he immediately reneges on his promise, like fellowship, kindred, and cousin. Goods, as a likely King Claudius, telling Hamlet to be moderate, informs every man that he, in fact, isn't moderate and has been damaging self instead of loving God. Every man, again, is deserted. Shocked by Good's treachery, every man is in despair as he is completely alone, with no one willing to help him. He decides to seek out good deeds, though like Gertrude, she is so weak from every man's sin and neglect, she cannot stand. Unlike his other friends, Good Deeds is willing to help him, but she is too weak to do so. Though she cannot accompany him in person, she says that her sister Knowledge can help him to clear his reckoning. Knowledge, in this case Horatio, guides every man Hamlet. But Ophelia too has the knowledge of the herbs. Knowledge then bestows upon every man a garment of sorrow, which allows every man to show contrition. She and Good Deeds request the presence of every man's new friends, discretion, strength, beauty, and 5 wits, who all agree to help every man during his pilgrimage. Every man weakens when he tries to climb into a grave and asks his companions to join him. Yet beauty, strength, discretion, and 5 wits all desert him, making him realize that all earthly things are but vanity. In contrast, Knowledge agrees to stay until the moment of his death, and every man's soul passes over to the afterlife. Knowledge, who like Horatio is left on the stage, remarks that she hears angels singing and that Good Deeds will make sure that every man goes to heaven. An angel then appears, welcoming every man into heaven, because of his crystal clear reckoning. There are enough resemblances to sustain the argument for an influence, in which case Hamlet dies the death of every man to an audience whose world of faith has been upended in recent memory, as have the assumptions they make about death. Yet nonetheless, Hamlet, as every man, dies as everyone must. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Duncan. That was a deeply philosophical approach, and it sort of opened my eyes to reading Shakespeare completely differently. So we can add another P to describing Shakespeare: playwright, poet, and philosopher. Anyway, time for questions now. Are there any questions in the audience?
Please. Question me, yes.
Right.
Oh, thank you. I was a bit surprised, as I hadn't thought of it at all, about your bringing in the medieval plays. I thought they were banned at some point, much earlier than Shakespeare would have been alive.
They were banned by Elizabeth, as she wanted to maintain her hold.
By Elizabeth?
Yes, but you see, Mary...
Not till Elizabeth.
Yeah, Mary revived them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and under Edward and under Henry, in a way, they were very anxious not to confront. I mean, they'd had the
pilgrimage,
the pilgrimage of grace, exactly.
Yes.
So Henry was in fear of that. Didn't want it to happen again. So he didn't really disturb what you would have called the rhythm and the pattern of people turning up to watch these plays. He regarded it as being relatively unimportant. But under Elizabeth, she wanted control. She wanted very much to control. Therefore, it wasn't just nostalgia. It was the fact that people had been forbidden this. You've only got to forbid something and immediately people feel resentful, etc. So that's, as I say, it's not quite enough evidence. We haven't got a photograph of Shakespeare standing next to his dad watching a medieval mystery or morality.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, there's also sufficient evidence to show that King Lear, for example, showed a great deal of influence from the play of the fall of the, what's the word? The harrowing of hell. If you look at Macbeth, especially the porter's words, which are taken from a medieval morality play, but it's also very much about the descent of a good angel into hell. I mean, it's so that's all I can say.
No, that definitely clears it up. Thank you.
Yes, that's back there.
Thank you so much for that. I'm just wondering, how much of a fine line is Shakespeare treading in terms of, with his plays, he has to appease the monarch at the time, and yet he's sort of conjuring imagery of like Catholicism through the ghost. Does he get away with that because he's using features of Seneca and tragedy? And would the audience be aware that he's tapping into the different beliefs that were in the audience? Sort of a long question. But...
Yeah, this is a very profound question. You're really asking, how did Shakespeare get away with it?
Yeah.
Robert Byrd, of course, William Byrd did as well, the great composer, because Elizabeth basically knew that he was the best composer in Europe, so he wasn't going to touch, but he had to be careful. With Shakespeare, it was slightly different. I don't know how Shakespeare ended up being in a playing troupe. I mean, I can share a surmise with you, if you like. In the Roman, in what's called, in the English college in Rome, there was an inscription of father and son of, they are Shakespeare, right, from Stratford-on-Avon. Now, this has been very singularly pointed out, but nobody's tried to explain it. I think it's possible that out of loyalty to his cousin, and it wasn't the only cousin who in fact died for his faith during that time, he may have gone to Rome, but then there was the double problem. And though I know lots of people get annoyed when I say this, but I'm pretty certain that Shakespeare was gay, that his love poetry, etc., has a certain vibrancy, which I would recognize as having that. But that, of course, alienated him from the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church was very definite that there was no vocation for the priesthood or anything like that if you were gay. So, and at the same time, of course, because he had these very close associations with recusants, he was in trouble there as well. So in a way, you could say that being part of a playwright, being a playwright for a player's troupe was probably the safest place he could be, especially as people were periodically turning mad, having visions, and therefore, of course, putting a certain distance between the affirmation of a faith and its performance in a play. But this is what I mean by actualization, because in his own sneaky way, Shakespeare actualizes all these faiths. He brings them really into prominence. And the interesting thing is, there's no one character who is a Calvinist. You could think that Polonius in his family would behave in a very puritanical way, but then the most fervent belief in life after death comes from Ophelia. So again, it really is, to use a phrase I used as a kid, it's a real mashup, but nonetheless, something is holding it together. And I feel that's the binding force of the medieval tradition.
Thank you very much.
There's another question here. Sorry.
Thank you, Duncan. I enjoyed that. That was very nuanced. You and I probably disagree slightly over how Catholic Shakespeare may have been, but that's not my question.
No, it's not a question you can ask.
No, well, one of the things I was thinking about towards the end of your talk, and I say I do really like your point about the everyman parallels, is the fact it is a play rather than a narrative poem. And it is a play in which there is not only a play and it's inside the play, but it's a play about surveillance and spectacle. And I wondered to what extent some of what you're talking about in terms of the that plurality that you were arguing for, how much of that depends or is undermined by the fact that it is a play rather than a single narrative poem?
Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare's own narrative poems, of course, take the passion from Southwell and apply it to sexual passion. And that's really what you get. There are one or two narrative poems which do seem to, I can't remember the name of it, but the later Baroque poems that do seem to echo some, another martyr. But again, it's slender, but it needs to be followed. As far as the main question is concerned, yes, it's a play. And see, this is why T.S. Eliot gets so angry with Hamlet, because yes, you can say it's a play, but what kind of species of understanding is a play? Sooner or later, it's got to touch reality. I mean, take the example I have of how do you write for Brexits and anti-Brexits? Well, maybe you could go back to the Corn Laws and, subtly underline that these different characters were divided over things which you know who were. So in that situation, again, you touch reality. So what I would say very simply is that you can't just say that something's a play, put it in an envelope, seal it and say, well, of course it can't be real. I mean, here, of course, I am being probably an outrageous heretic as far as survival amongst post, modernist views. But nonetheless, I think, I mean, when I listen to Beethoven, it's real. And if Beethoven hadn't written it the way he did, it wouldn't be real. So I hope that's an adequate answer.
I was thinking more about the audience rather,
Yes.
rather than just how watching a play that is in many ways quite self-referential, alongside all the plurality of approaches to death that you're presenting, how might that, I suppose it's about are the people in the audience, it touches on the point that the question that was just made, are the people in the audience recognizing themselves and their own views there, or are they getting hints of all the different views through
I'd
the play?
accept that, the idea that they are getting hints of all the different views. So there's no character being identified as a Calvinist, no character being identified as a Catholic. There's no character even being identified as a Stoic. What is happening, though, is that at each stage, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to analyze the word soul, because it has a way of taking, what's the word I'm trying to think of? It is intensifying the religious aspects as they turn up almost incidentally. I mean, if you look at the dramatic force, nobody's arguing about religion. Nobody dies because of a religion. It's just there, constantly being sparked off all the time. And I think you're right to say that at this stage in his career, Shakespeare was very confident. The Shakespeare of the great tragedies is a very, very strong, confident writer. He reminds me of Dostoevsky in his later career. No one was going to stop him. So I think that to a certain extent, the answer is yes. But I mean, who was going to go backstage and point? I don't think anybody would, because he was a playwright. Does that? Yeah. Okay. There must be more questions, because what I've said is inherently controversial.
Anyone in the audience? No? I have a question, actually. Well, an observation. In his role as a dramatist, Shakespeare was, I think what he was doing is throwing questions at the audiences. And in his depiction of Hamlet, do you think he's done that?
I think Hamlet is provocation throughout. And that's what gives it its fascination. It's next to the most popular play, given that it's the longest and that everybody virtually dies, given the fact that it's mostly about death and corruption and the stench of Elsinore, which are not in themselves inherently attractive ideas, but nonetheless, it rivets people. It rivets, I mean, for me, the superb production is John Gielgud's, especially John Gielgud's radio adaptation. But there are other adaptations, and you always feel riveted by the uncertainty, the way in which delicate intuitions suddenly harden, the way in which the whole net tightens. He is provoking the audience. He wants them to come to the wrong conclusions. You know, it's a bit like a thriller, except that if it were a thriller, suppose if it were a thriller, it wouldn't work, because thrillers don't treat death in the same actualizing way. You know, once you, yeah, okay, there's the corpse, okay, there's a report, yes, there's the DNA, that's it. You're not really interested anymore. It's more to do with the crime. Yes, you could say Agatha Christie actualizes crime. Yes, but certainly not death. And it's that's the fascination with this. I think it's most people's favorite play, but I mean, you know, obviously people who wouldn't go along with that. But again, I would say that the answer to the question is that it provokes throughout.
Absolutely. And it also, in my opinion, I may be completely wrong, brings out questions about eternity, you know, the soul, the body is finite. And then this question between body and soul, you know, is the body a prison for the soul? And
Yeah.
once the soul is released from the prison, it's eternal.
That would be, yeah, but you see, you've got a mousetrap. For Calvin, if you are of the elect, then you go straight to heaven. If you're not of the elect, if you're reprobate, you go to hell. There's no status in between. Now, an awful lot of what Hamlet is deliberating about is the idea that there could be a status in between, which is, of course, a forbidden idea. I mean, Calvin, in his orders in Geneva, and the influence those orders had in Scotland and in England, did his utmost to actually forbid. I mean, I know there's one, actually it touches on something recently, but there's one example, I think, of a woman being imprisoned because she prayed for her daughter after she died. We look at that and think, oh, but this was what Calvin was doing. He was basically wanting to impose an order. And also, Queen Elizabeth wanted to impose the Anglican order, and of course part of that was a Calvinist vein. So we look at it now, right? We are actualized in Hamlet because we have all sorts of ideas. We just, you know, we tend to be living in a scientific age, and our scientism tends to clash with the idea of there being any supernatural at all. But that doesn't stop Shakespeare from provoking us. Okay.
We're nearing the end of our hour. Well, hour and a half, really. Are there any more questions?
Please.
No? Oh.
Yes.
Yeah, please.
What happened to the people who are on?
Pardon?
What happened to the people who are on Zoom? All right, okay.
Hi, I was just going to ask, because you mentioned it about being a crime text, that if you were exploring it as a crime text, would you say that Hamlet himself was a victim, villain, or detective?
Yes, that's a very good question, because I was hinting at the end that Hamlet is an elect soul, but he's also every man, and the closest resemblance to the language of the medieval play is at the very end of Hamlet, where all of a sudden the scene changes and everything smiles and angels descend, etc. Even though Hamlet's own death was accidental, I don't think it was suicide. I think it was just acceptance. So I think that's interesting, because I would say Hamlet keeps up his ambivalence right to the end. Shakespeare's going to keep you guessing beyond the grave. He's not really, yes, a Calvinist could say, yes, this is a blessed soul. This is an elect person going to heaven. Or they could say, yes, this is a sorrowful, repentant soul going into purgatory, etc. And a Stoic, of course, could say, yes, this is a man being received by the gods into the reward of virtue. But I mean, not many Stoics were pagan Stoics. I mean, I'd be interested to know how many of them went that far when you didn't need to. I mean, it was sufficient to be a skeptical Stoic.
I think we'll need to wind up. If it's a very short question, we might have a short reply
Yes,
before we
sorry, I've
wind
been
up.
a bit long replying.
I'm just thinking about death. Plays written when Queen Elizabeth is coming to the end of her reign. Do you think Shakespeare is conjuring sort of Catholic imagery to play on the fear of the transference of power and perhaps more religious turbulence to come?
Yes, I think that Shakespeare is provoking. He's provoking respectable Church of England people with this idea that Calvin has completely got rid of, but he's provoking them with the very thing that provokes us today: the mystery, the uncertainty, the hypothetical possibility, etc. So I think that I don't want to broach the question as to whether Shakespeare was a Catholic. I mean, I was a bit abrupt, but I mean, there is a certain tendency amongst some scholars to be arguing, possibly really against the limits of credibility, that Shakespeare would have been a Catholic. I mean, Shakespeare was living exposed to all sorts of reports. He was living in a police state. And therefore, yes, you could argue that the absence of any biographical information about Shakespeare that's of any relevance could be that but more for the sake of his family, though, that he didn't want to have anything dug up about him. But again, that's just speculative. I think the issue as to what Shakespeare's own beliefs were, I don't think that that's something available to literary scholarship. Sorry, could you repeat that? Sorry, can you?
I'm just thinking more about Queen Elizabeth not having an heir,
Yes.
and perhaps these sort of conflicting ideas that he's mirroring back into the audience. Is he perhaps playing on their fears as to who might take over and what sort of religious campaign they might have and the consequences that might have for people?
Absolutely, I agree with that. I mean, 1612, I'm hopeless at my dates for monarchs, but I mean, James was definitely on the throne, I think. Shakespeare, we know, was probably rather disappointed in James. But nonetheless, it's interesting that changeover, as you say, was the time when, in fact, Shakespeare was writing these great tragedies. So you're quite right to say that, in a way, Shakespeare is playing with his audience, because the audience will be turning out wanting to know what on earth this man was. Half of them wouldn't even know that there had been a change. I mean, Elizabeth's funeral would have been only a few months before. So you're right. I think that's correct.
Well, thank you very much, Duncan. And it's raised a lot of questions in me, actually, this exposition of yours, because was Shakespeare really into religion? Turns out that, yes, he may have been thinking of those things, you know, about history taking its course and what are people going to be thinking and so on and so forth. Anyway, it's been very enjoyable for me. And before we end, I just wanted to make you aware that we are planning to have a few more sessions on under this category, poetry. And the plan is to have a talk on Blake by Victor Sage, who is emeritus professor of Gothic literature. And we are also planning another talk on Byron, because Byron's death happens to coincide with the bicentenary celebrations of the BRLSI coming up in 2024. So that's something to look forward to. And Duncan said I should also mention another talk that's on the Sanskrit language that I'll be giving on the 16th of October, because Sanskrit is a language, although it's dead, and it's an official language written for conveying scientific principles, but the method of conveyance was actually rhyming couplets. So if you're interested, that's on the 16th of October. And please look out for the announcements for the other two sessions that we have planned. So thank you very much, audience, and look forward to seeing you again soon.